Containers in .NET 8 with Andrew Locke.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with ultimate confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software consulting company serving companies that are struggling with past failures of business-critical software projects. And they really deliver, establishing high quality in the project, achieving rock solid stability and moving at the speed of your business. So when a project failure is not an option, ClearMeasure guarantees your project. You can find them at clearmeasure.com. Quick announcement, my architect forums are going strong. Signups for the next session are up. And if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, just sign up at the link in the show notes. And for those of you who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. Now, my guest today on the show, coming back after 2 years, is Andrew Locke. He's a senior software engineer at Datadog, working out of Devon in the UK, and he's a Microsoft MVP. He's also an author of a few books, ASP.NET Core in Action, several editions, and he has an active, very active blog all about his experience working with .NET and ASP.NET Core, and you can find that at andrewlocke.net. We'll put that in the show notes. But Andrew, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm glad to have you back. And just recent news, you just put out a new .NET 7 version of your book. Can we plug that?
I did, yeah. That was released last year. It was obviously we've now moved on to .NET 8.
That's right.
But thankfully, that's most of the things in the book are still completely relevant. So I got lucked out a bit there with the developments.
That's right. Well, keep the book fresh. I mean, that's a really good topic. ASP.NET Core in Action. So
absolutely.
Well, we'll put a link in the show notes to the podcast that we did a couple of years back, actually diving into web applications in the .NET 6 timeframe, which I think so much of that is still relevant today. But just kind of back, what's been going on in the last couple of years? What's changed in your world?
From my point of view, I'm mostly still working primarily on the library side. I don't do a huge amount of web development in my day job because I'm working for Datadog. So we focus on APM, telemetry, open telemetry, that sort of thing. So most of the web development I've been doing is just in the back end, and my downtime just digging through a lot of the ASP.NET Core repositories, see what's been changing in the various releases.
Yeah. Well, I got to imagine at Datadog, I got to imagine the last couple of years have been really, really busy with the rise and adoption of open telemetry and other things in the observability space.
Absolutely. There's a huge push towards open telemetry in the ecosystem in general, but then in .NET as well. We're in kind of a privileged position in the open telemetry being somewhat baked in with activities for recent versions of .NET anyway. So means that really we're in quite a good place in .NET. And I think the Aspire announcements in .NET 8 with all the dashboards and how relatively simple it is to just get things up and running just shows how the bits are all there. They're all plugged through into the core of the framework. You can still get all this telemetry from HTTP clients and from ASP.NET Core with very little work. So it's all quite exciting times, yeah.
Yeah. Well, anytime something new comes out, there's always the question, all right, are the marketing people pushing it and talking about it at the conferences, but really we need to wait until version 3, or we need to wait for a few gaps to fill. So in your opinion, is open telemetry like totally ready and everybody should be using it, or are there still like obvious gaps that people are going to stub their toe on?
So open telemetry in general, yes, people should absolutely be using it. I think it's across the entire industry. Everything is sort of pushing towards open telemetry in general. It doesn't have everything. There's a lot of things like profiling isn't built into OpenTelemetry yet. There's things that are there. The logs specs is all relatively recently developed, and so it's still evolving. It's definitely evolving, but it's definitely also going to be the future, realistically, of most people's telemetry. And with Datadog, we can connect to OpenTelemetry things. We have our own versions of stuff because we support like .NET Framework and older versions and things as well, which you don't necessarily get with OpenTelemetry. I think that's one thing, is that it depends, but OpenTelemetry is definitely a good choice. If you can't go wrong with it, I would definitely say that.
Got it. So any listeners out there who are wondering, man, I've heard of that thing, but I really haven't done it. Basically, they should just pull down the NuGet packages and hook it up and get going, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think one of the things that they ask, whether Aspire will come to anything or not is unclear at the moment, but just the demonstration of how everything hooks up very easily, and you can just get all of these metrics and logs and traces out of your application. I think that is a good demo, just for people who haven't seen it. Have a look at that and see what you could be getting.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Awesome. Well, you're one of the people that is deep in the just telemetry and observability world in general. So you would know. But I want to ask you about containers, because you've got an amazing blog post detailing out just in detail the changes in containers in .NET 8. But to get into that, what's your opinion and your sense just on the state of containers for .NET developers?
I mean, personally, I would consider like containers to be the de facto deployment mechanism in a lot of cases. I feel like they just have solved so many issues for years for me now at this point, particularly Linux containers. I think I've never been completely sold on Windows containers. They're a nice idea, but because they were obviously sort of retrofit to try and mimic Linux, it always feels like they're second class in everything. And whereas Linux containers, I would definitely deploy my apps using Linux containers in general. It just solves so many of the dependency issues, which is the biggest thing for me. And having that single deployable artifact is just, your app can be run anywhere. If you want to run it in Azure, you can run it in Azure. If you want to run it on Kubernetes, you run it in Kubernetes. You can take it to AWS anywhere you want. So I definitely favor them as a deployment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. I just want to start with that because there's some people that live primarily in just a website world, and they look at how simple and easy, let's say, Azure App Service is, and they're like, I don't have any pain. Why would I want this? And that's true. If you don't have any pain, you're good anyway. But
Absolutely.
There's a huge software ecosystem out there.
Yeah, that's it. I think, like you say, if you haven't got any pain and you don't have any problems just deploying to Azure App Service, fine. Like there's no reason you have to use containers. It's they give you flexibility, and they do solve a certain class of issues in general. Dependencies being the biggest one to solve.
So I want to kind of publicly give you credit. One of my teams at ClearMeasure was moving from .NET, an application from .NET 7 to 8, and it was on Azure Container Apps with the .NET 7 versions, and upgrading to .NET 8, no big deal. But then the automated deployments and the infrastructure as code, creating things, it just didn't automatically work, and they kind of course, bang your head on the computer a little bit, and they found your blog post on the changes in .NET 8 for containers, and the light switch went off, they changed some stuff, and it was perfect.
Excellent.
So again, we'll point people to that blog post, but it's not just, there were a few tweaks. It looks like they've done a ton. Like it looks like some strategy change has been in the mix from the .NET 7 to .NET 8 era. Tell us what's your view? What has Microsoft actually done in this past year and a half?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few major things that have come out of this, but one of the biggest additions they've made is using chiseled containers. which is something they've been trialing since .NET 6. Even they've been putting them out as nightly Docker images since then, but now they're fully fledged just in the Docker Hub repository or the Microsoft Container Registry, just their standard repository. So chiseled containers are interesting. They basically take a normal Ubuntu or similar Docker image, and then they cut out everything you don't need. And when I say everything, I mean literally everything. You don't have a package manager, you don't have curl, you don't even have bash, so you can't run scripts in these files. But it makes them, for one, much smaller, but almost more importantly, much more secure, because if there's nothing in your container for people to run, they can't run it. Like they literally, you can't open a shell into this container because there's no bash for you to use or equivalent. So it's primarily a security thing in my mind, but it's definitely something worth considering. It has complexities because you can't exec into a pod. You can't examine the file system just using bash. So it definitely has those complexities.
Okay.
And there's a bunch of repercussions with that as well, which you can explore later.
All right, you use this term chiseled, which is not a term that I've associated with anything techie, So when you say specifically, what does it mean to be a chiseled container?
So as far as I'm aware, chiseling is a chisel is a tool that Ubuntu or Canonical that make Ubuntu have created in order to basically do this job, to cut away all the bits you don't need, to chisel away all of the things which aren't required to run your app. So what you get is almost like an appliance level thing. Like it will run your app and it will do nothing else once it's been chiseled. So Microsoft basically they take the sort of Ubuntu container, they install the .NET runtime things in it, everything you need, all the dependencies, and then they remove everything else. So if you can literally just run your application without any other dependencies, you can run theoretically in these chiseled containers, and you'll have all these extra layers of essentially security, because you can't break into this container because
there's nothing to break into.
There's nothing there.
It makes me think of some of these IoT systems on a chip where you deploy your application and there's literally nothing else that chip is doing except an entry point for your program.
Exactly. It's definitely that sort of feeling. It's sort of like, it's like a hardened version of sort of standard Docker files.
Yeah. Well, that concept kind of makes sense. And I'm thinking, okay, where I might have had my application on startup do a couple of things environmental in nature that might have used, like even curl or just some type of operating system, run a shell script or something on application startup to help with the setup. And in order to take advantage of this, I need to externalize whatever that setup was to my deployment automation so that the application is literally just .NET code, calling APIs, pulling in data, pushing out data, and not relying on any kind of operating system support, right?
Exactly. It's got to be entirely self-contained in that point of view. It's like you say, there's no shell for it to call out to. So aside, like if you do just have a standard ASP.NET Core application, say, theoretically you're fine. It's as soon as all of those extra bits, I don't know if you're trying to call out to Git or if you're trying to do anything extra, then that's where you're going to struggle. And it's where I ran into this initially, in fact, was in the Docker files. If you're trying to do something in the Docker file of the final chiseled container, you can't have any run commands in that Docker file because there's nothing to run it with.
Yeah.
Which is where things get problematic. You have to use multi-layered, multi-stage Docker files, do all the work in a different container, essentially, and then copy all the bits you need into that final one, which is often a good practice anyway, but you just means you can't do any of those other bits in the final container.
That's interesting. And you're right. Real applications, they start simple with just, it's some web pages and it shows some things on the screen and it calls a web service. But really quickly you get other things. And integration, I'm thinking of integration. Sometimes you have to do really interesting things to integrate C# to some other service that requires some type of file to be FTP'd over to it. So now you have like an FTP command line sitting under the cover. Well, boom, now you're going to run into problems here because integration requires all kinds of funky things that you got to do sometimes, especially with older systems.
Exactly. So it's not going to work for everyone. It's just one of those things. I think you could certainly start with it. You could give it a try, see if they work for you. If they don't, then you always have to think about security and defense in depth. It's just an extra layer of security. Just if you're not using chiseled containers, that's fine. I mean, that's what we have been doing for the last 6 years with .NET already. So it's not a problem. It's just it gives you that opportunity for an extra layer of security. So, and as part of that,
in order to test these out, is it just a matter of selecting a different image in your deployment and seeing if it worked? Or is there something else?
No, that's pretty much it. You just change in the from stage of your Docker file, select a different image. So instead of just using the 8, like the Microsoft.com/.net/ASP.NET 8.0, you select the 8.0 - jammy chiseled is the funny names, but and like I say, depending on what you've got in your Docker file, that may or may not work. If you've got any run stages in your Docker file, that won't work. So you may need to restructure your Docker file generally so that you can do things in a different stage that's in a non-chisel container, and then so like the SDK container, and then copy those into the chisel one at the end. The other thing you have to think about is culture and globalization, because they don't have any of the ICU libraries and things that you need to do culture and globalization. And so that it's all set to the invariant globalization in those. So if you need to have like globalization, then there's a separate one called chiseled-extra, which does have all those extra libraries installed.
Okay. So they have different levels of chiseling based on common, they're kind of guessing what people might need, what levels people might need.
Exactly. Although now I think about it, I don't think the ASP.NET Docker file, I don't think there is a extra version of that. So if you need to use that, you essentially have to build up your own version based on I'm not even sure you could do that, actually. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I see one called runtime depths 8.0 jammy chiseled extra.
Yeah, so the runtime depth stuff, the runtime definitely does, but I'm not sure whether the ASP.NET one does.
Okay. Well, I mean,
so if you're deploying as a self-contained application, then that's fine. You could do that using the runtime depths. You could use the chiseled extra and then deploy your ASP.NET Core app as a self-contained application. Then that would work.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Now, for those who might not be familiar, what does it mean to be a self-contained ASP.NET application?
So there's basically two different ways, although certainly was two different ways to deploy. You could deploy as framework dependent, in which case you need the .NET and ASP.NET Core framework to be deployed on that PC. So this was always sort of how you had it with .NET Framework. Every Windows app has .NET Framework installed on it already. You just deploy your application there, and it uses that whatever's installed there to run. The framework-dependent ASP.NET and .NET Core is exactly the same. It requires you've already installed .NET 7 or .NET 8 on that PC or on the machine, and then it can run. With self-contained, it actually includes the whole framework with your application, which means you can deploy multiple versions of the framework. Well, you can do that anyway, but you can deploy multiple patch versions of the framework, and you can also take advantage of trimming, in which the build process strips out all of the bits of the framework it doesn't need. And then in .NET 8, you can take advantage of potentially native AOT and all the potential advantages that can give you as well. And there's now all these additional ways you can deploy your application. But fundamentally, framework dependent is the machine already has the framework installed and self-contained. You bring the framework with you.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but if I bring the framework with me, then I can use the command lines that do the tree shaking and not bring the entire framework with me, but only the parts of it that I actually used. Am I thinking about that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that trimming means it can the compiler can go through and work out everything you don't need and just strip it out. Yeah.
Now, does that just save me disk space, or does that actually save me memory, RAM as well?
It's a good question.
I've actually not measured it.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how much. My gut feeling is it must change stuff because you're loading fewer bytes into memory when you load the assemblies. So I believe it does reduce it. And it must do, but I would wager that is not the biggest issue with how much memory your application is taking. It's not simply size of it on disk. But
right.
In most cases, it's going to be everything else you're doing.
Now, I've profiled DevOps pipelines, and it seems like by and large, most of the time going into all the automation across all the different environments is copying files from one place to another. And so I would expect that time to go down if you cut down the amount of stuff you're copying all those times in half.
Yeah, I would have thought so. I mean, and that's part of the benefit with having these chiseled containers getting smaller. And there's another version of the .NET, of the ASP.NET image they've produced. They're producing composite images, which are like ready to run composite images, which basically means, so ready to run means that your normal like JIT compiled application is ahead of time compiled, which is not quite the same as the native AOT, but it means that you can have faster startup on your to the runtime. And so with their composite images, they basically deploy the entire ASP.NET Core framework as they sort of munge it all together into a single binary. And that means you can get extra performance and you can get extra size reduction.
Okay.
Because you can do all sorts of extra optimizations there across assembly boundaries, which you couldn't normally do. So that's another type of image that they produced for .NET 8.
Nice. I know there's no way we're going to be able to cover every change that they made, but what are the other big ones, other big container changes in your opinion?
So the biggest one is probably you can now run as a non-root user, which is another security related thing. So that's required for the chiseled containers. You're not allowed to run as a root user in that case, but you can do it even if you can't use the chiseled ones. You can still take advantage of the non-root user, which will just give you that extra layer of security. And then the one that's maybe going to bite people is that the default port inside a Docker container has changed. It's no longer port 80, it's now port 8080. So if you're running your Docker container and trying to map into port 80, it won't work by default anymore if you just change the Docker image.
Do you have any idea the rationale in that, the reasoning behind doing it?
So it's all tied together because the reason is that the non-root user can't bind to port 80 because 80 is considered a privileged port.
Okay.
So if you're using chisel containers, you have to use a non-root user. If you're using a non-root user, you have to use a different port.
Okay.
So they've chosen 8080 as something higher that's often used.
So it was a requirement. Okay, we got to change to something else. Let's change to something else. So you just got to remember it, and then once you remember it, it's no big deal.
Exactly, and it's just the defaults again. So if you want to, you can still use the .NET 8 images. You could use the root user, and you could set the port to be port 80. It's just it won't default to port 80. That's the difference. So if you're already setting a specific port that you're binding to in your Docker, in your app inside the Docker image, if you're doing that anyway, nothing's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the default. If you don't change it, will be 8080.
Now, is the philosophy to externalize SSL and TLS and run as port 8080 internally versus 443?
Yeah, it's typical. I think most of the Docker deployments I've seen have been exactly that, just a HTTP for the application, because basically otherwise you've got to try and get those SSL certificates into the container,
Mm-hmm.
and there's ways of doing that. It's just it starts to get messy. So most of the things I've seen have been, you externalize the TLS termination, and then you just do HTTP over the wire there. Now, that might not work for some people. If you've got particularly sensitive setups, then that may not be possible for you. In which case, you can absolutely do TLS termination inside the Docker image. You just got to get the certificates into it.
Yeah,
and nothing's really changed in that respect.
I like the simplification, because even on Azure App Service, the encryption HTTPS is kind of done for you, but every app that you deploy, you still have to mess with it. And whereas if Azure Container Apps, and of course I'm partial to simple, and I've gone down the rabbit hole of Kubernetes, and I'm thinking, man, can we just not have to do it? Can it just be set up and working for us? So I love Azure Container Apps that way, and having it externalized so that okay, it's working, great. I got the encryption, I got the transport level encryption, but not every deployment and every container has to worry about transport encryption. It's kind of just provided. I love that. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm completely with you. It's sort of what is your what are you worried about fundamentally? Are you worried about people getting into your container apps deployments and intercepting the data going between your containers? Probably not. You're probably far more worried about just having that HTTPS on the public internet and having that encrypted, and that's what matters. Well, and I think for 99% of the cases, that's going to be the case.
If somebody gets into that layer, we've got bigger problems.
Exactly.
Much bigger. It's kind of like, I remember, just decades ago, some people came up with the argument of like, hey, should we be encrypting between application layer A and application layer B, or process A or process B, that are kind of running on the same server at that time? I'm like, look, if they're on the server, we've got so many other problems.
Exactly. And that's it. It's all about your threat models, really. And for most people, it's going to work absolutely fine to just have HTTP inside the Docker container, as long as you've got something else which is managing those connections for you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, port 8080. That's something good, something to remember. And would you recommend totally unique usernames? Now, is that the recommendation, to have every application have a distinct run as user, or what's the guidance?
So no, in general, no. The important thing is that it's not the root user. The actual user you choose probably doesn't matter so much, but the .NET 8 images have all got a separate non-root user built in, which you can reference. It's called app is the name of the user. So when you're doing your Docker run, you can pass in like /user app, and then it will just use the non-root user. And that's the one you should just use, because it's already set up, basically.
Okay.
You can also define that in your Docker file rather than using the Docker run command. So if you can set it, bake it into the container, and they've got a environment variable set, which is app UID, something like that, which you can just use that inside the Docker file, and then it will just always run as the non-root user by default.
Okay, just a different username, and I get the security for free. Love it.
Exactly.
Love it. All right, before we kind of wrap it up, is there any other biggie that we need to make sure to mention?
So Windows images, if you are using Windows Docker files, they only have the version specific ones now. So previously, if you do Docker pull ASP.NET 8, if you're on Linux, it would pull a Linux image. If you're on Windows, it would pull a Windows image. that doesn't work on Windows now. You now always have to specify Nano Server or Windows Server Core, which is fine. It's one thing that it messed me up when I was doing various upgrades, because we had to go through and change all the Docker images. It wasn't just changing 7 to 8. You had to go and specifically specify which version you need and things like that. But again, it's not a big deal. It's just something that will bite you if you don't know about it.
Now, I'll admit, I don't know many actual production users of Windows containers, and you're one of them, right?
Well, so we use Windows containers for testing is the main thing in the Datadog tracer, but we certainly have customers that use Windows containers. It certainly is a thing. It's not necessarily a thing that I enjoy.
So you're saying they technically do work, and when you absolutely need them, you can use them, but you don't like using them? They're just cumbersome?
Exactly. It's just the cumbersome. They're slow. They're really big. They,
What is the size these days? I don't even know.
So I think the Nano Server ones are hundreds of megabytes rather than gigabytes, but the server core is gigabytes. For an image, and so it's a lot of bytes flying around, and some things just feel cumbersome. I think fundamentally it doesn't feel like it's native. Like when you're in Docker containers for Linux, it just feels like a Linux machine. It's completely native. Whereas Windows, it all feels tacked on. And so there's certainly arguments for why you want to do it, and they're much the same arguments for why you want to use Linux containers. They just don't fundamentally work as well, in my opinion.
Yeah. So if we've got some older software and we absolutely need the compartmentalization within a Windows operating system, we've got that solution we can reach for, and it does work, and it's there, but it's kind of a niche need. Yeah,
exactly. And it does have the advantages of the same thing as Linux containers, where you've got it all defined in your Docker file. It's all declarative about how to build it. You've got your dependencies self-contained. It feels a lot closer to that VM edge as opposed to the appliance edge.
Yeah. Well, just the other day, and you mentioned Linux containers just feel like Linux. I was struck just the other day where I was setting up a new rack at a new house, and I hadn't put my Pi-hole DNS server in place that I have just to kind of chisel down my internet connection, because my kids don't need the full internet, if you get my drift, right? So I'm chiseling down my internet connection. And I thought, I'm just not just going to set this in the rack. And so I got my 1U faceplate that holds 4 Raspberry Pis and, keeps them organized in there. And of course I don't need 4, but I just stuck the Raspberry Pi in there and setting it up from absolute scratch, and I kind of sudo app and all the commands to set up Docker, and then I set up Portainer, and then I go into Portainer and set up Pi-hole, and it just runs, and I map the port, and then I'm like, wait, I'm kind of done. It was just some command lines, and it worked, and it dropped in, and it felt like I'm just running command lines here, and not this big Herculean, cumbersome thing.
Exactly, that's it, and that's really the beauty of the Docker files and Docker containers. I think is that repeatability. That's entirely what it's about. You just know, you just do the same thing, you're going to be okay.
Yeah. And by the way, I'll throw it in, totally not related, but since I went down the modern DNS rabbit hole, I discovered Cloudflare's new DNS server. It's got to been using 1.1.1.1 for a while. Whereas before I used Google's 8.8. And maybe they've had it out for years, but I realized they have work chiseled DNS, and then they have family chiseled DNS. Chiseled's my word, right? But 1.1.1.2 is to cut out parts of the internet that are not safe for work. 1.1.1.3 is to cut out parts of the internet not safe for your family. So they have 3 different levels of DNS servers that you can use now.
Oh, nice. I did not know that.
Yeah. Nice. So again, my kids do not need the full internet. So, well, Andrew, before we close out, is there anything that we need to mention before we close out on this topic?
I don't think so. There's some other minor little changes and things, but I think we've covered the bulk of the issues.
Awesome. Well, again, we'll include the link to the blog post in the show notes, because it's a very comprehensive write-up. You went into all the details. I'm guessing that you banged your head up against the computer a number of times to figure all this out. So thanks.
Absolutely.
We thank you for your pain. But well, thanks for coming back on the show and sharing with us your experience in the latest in containers for .NET 8.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure indeed. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.